So let's get started with the primary endocrine organs. We really won't be spending much time at all on the secondary organs. Of main interest to us is the pituitary gland, and we'll see that has quite a few hormones that we have to learn. And the pituitary regulates activities of quite a few glands. The thyroid gland affects metabolic rate as well as calcium levels. Adrenal gland is involved in the fight or flight response, which is called the sympathetic system, and that releases epinephrine, used to be called adrenaline. And the adrenal gland is also involved with metabolic control. Our stress hormones come from the adrenal gland. Mineral balance is important with the adrenal gland. The pineal gland, all you have to know is that it secretes melatonin and functions in the circadian rhythm. Parathyroid glands are right behind the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland is on the anterior of your trachea, and the four tiny little parathyroid glands are on the posterior of the thyroid gland. And the parathyroid gland is important in regulating calcium. Pancreas, as you know, is important for regulating glucose. And so let's get into each gland individually. Don't worry about the second messengers, any of that. We're not really interested in that kind of detail. And of course, know the location of all of your glands. So the pituitary is often been called a master gland. It is in the brain. It is nestled within a little bony cavity of the sphenoid bone called the sella turcica, and it secretes 9 hormones, although really we're only going to talk about 8 of them. 7 are secreted by the anterior pituitary, and 2 are released from the posterior pituitary. So really the pituitary is basically functioning as 2 separate glands, the anterior and the posterior. So here's a picture of the parathyroid, the anterior lobe and the smaller posterior lobe, and it's in this little bony cavity called the sella turcica. The hormones, we'll look at each one of these hormones. Hormones from the posterior lobe are ADH and OT. It's the 2-letter code for that is just OT, oxytocin. And then here are the hormones of the anterior pituitary. And basically we're skipping the melanocyte stimulating hormone, MSH. So the anterior pituitary secretes tropic hormones. A tropic hormone is a hormone that stimulates other glands to secrete hormones or other glands to act. So look at this first one, TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. So this hormone goes to the thyroid and stimulates it. So each one of these has a code. This letter code, I would learn those as well as the hormone. So here's our first one, thyroid stimulating hormone. It stimulates the thyroid to release the thyroid hormones. ACTH is the hardest one for students to remember because it's got kind of a long name here. Adrenocorticotropic hormone. So let's take that word apart. Adreno is going to bring to mind the adrenal gland on top of the kidneys. Cortico, well, in the brain system, we learned that the brain has an outer layer called the cortex. And often when you have 2 layers of some structure, the inner layer, the inner portion is called the medulla, and the outer is called the cortex. So this is referring to the cortex. So it is stimulating the outer layer of the adrenal gland, and it is a tropic hormone, meaning it's stimulating the cells of the adrenal cortex to release their hormones. Gonadotropins regulate the activities of the gonads, and gonads are the sex organs that produce sperm and eggs. And these 2 gonadotropins, because they stimulate the gonads, are FSH and LH. FSH is called follicle stimulating hormone because it was found to stimulate the follicles or egg development in the female. But keep in mind, this is a pituitary hormone, so men also produce FSH, but males will have a different target cell. So FSH promotes the maturation of sperm. LH in females, you'll see a peak in LH on day 14 of the menstrual cycle, just before ovulation occurs. So LH induces ovulation. In males, it stimulates the production of sex hormones. And we'll see more detail on that in the reproductive chapter, but the most important male sex hormone is testosterone. Growth hormone, or GH, we saw that in the bone chapter. It stimulates cell growth and reproduction. So it encourages the cells to take in nutrients and to make proteins and to do what cells normally do. Prolactin stimulates mammary gland development and milk production. And then we're going to skip MSH. So here are the hormones of the anterior lobe of the pituitary. Thyroid stimulating hormone stimulates the thyroid. Adrenocorticotropic hormone stimulates the cortex or outer layer of the adrenal gland. FSH stimulates the follicles. LH stimulates, both FSH and LH stimulate the ovaries and testes. We don't need more detail than that at this point. Growth hormone stimulates growth in the muscular and skeletal system. Prolactin stimulates milk production. Now the posterior lobe produces two hormones. It's kind of interesting because the posterior lobe is connected to the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus has neurons, and those neurons grow into the pituitary, the posterior pituitary, and they release the two hormones. So it's actually the neurons that are producing those hormones and releasing them from the pituitary, the posterior lobe. So ADH, anti-diuretic hormone. You probably know what a diuretic is. It is often called a water pill. So we take a diuretic if we need to release water from the body. For example, if our blood pressure is too high, it means we have too much water in the bloodstream and we need to release some of that water. So that's what a diuretic does. So an antidiuretic would do just the opposite. It would make us retain water. And oxytocin stimulates the uterus during contraction, during childbirth. Some more information on ADH. All this information is not, don't feel you have to memorize it. But an interesting thing is ADH also causes vasoconstriction, which will help raise the blood pressure. If you drink alcohol, you may notice that you urinate more than the fluid that you drank. Is because alcohol inhibits ADH release. And that losing that water from the body will often give you a headache. And then oxytocin stimulates smooth muscle contraction during delivery. It also stimulates, it promotes the ejection of milk. So women who have had babies and who breastfeed have this feeling of, it's called milk letdown, where the oxytocin, during suckling, the oxytocin is going to stimulate the release of the milk from the glands into the ducts and to the nipple. And this is a particular feeling that they can feel in their breasts. And oxytocin also has something to do with sexual arousal. So try to remember goat flap. This represents the 8 pituitary hormones. So let's go over those. G, growth hormone. O, oxytocin. There's 2 A's. So maybe put an O and an A together from the posterior pituitary, and that would be ADH. T, thyroid stimulating hormone. F, follicle stimulating hormone. L, luteinizing hormone, or LH. A, the second A is diuretic, so ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, and then P is the prolactin. So practice your goat flap and learn your 8 major pituitary hormones. So we're going to look at a little more detail here. Again, there's often too much. Just read through so you understand something about the thyroid. A lot of humans have problems with their thyroid gland. It's actually 2 lobes connected by tissue. And here you can see that thyroid gland. So the thyroid gland is filled with thyroid follicles. We'll go back up here and look. And so if you were to look at the tissue, you would find these look at that, simple cuboidal cells, which often secrete. So here's our thyroid follicle. And they're hollow, and inside is this viscous fluid containing proteins. So the cells produce thyroglobulin, and this thyroglobulin requires iodine, and this will be stored inside the follicle. Outside the follicles, there are cells that produce a calcium-regulating hormone, calcitonin. You may remember that again from the bone chapter. Calcitonin lowers blood calcium. So the main thing to remember is that the thyroid gland produces T3 and T4, and the T3 tells us that there are 3 iodine atoms, and T4 tells us there are 4 iodine atoms. And again, here's some example of too much information, TMI here. But what is the thyroid involved in? It is involved in our metabolic rate. So some people have low thyroid and they will be cold. Some people have hyperthyroid condition, and they are going to be very antsy and a lot of movement, and so thyroid hormones T3 and T4 regulate how our cells use the nutrients. So the thyroid hormones raise the metabolic rate, increase the heart rate and force of contraction, increase sensitivity to sympathetic stimulation, that's the fight or flight response, stimulate red blood cell formation, turnover of minerals in bone, stimulate activity in other endocrine tissue. So it's pretty diverse actions of the thyroid hormones on the body. So where is the thyroglobulin stored? In the thyroid follicles. What is the primary effect of thyroid hormones? Raise the metabolic rate. And we'll finish off this video with the parathyroid glands. There are 4 of them on the posterior surface of the thyroid. So here we are looking at the backside of the thyroid gland, and you can see those 4 tiny little parathyroid glands, and they will produce parathyroid hormone, PTH, and that has the opposite effect of the thyroid hormone calcitonin. So calcitonin lowered blood calcium. parathyroid hormone will raise blood calcium. And there are also cells called oxyphils with no known function. So parathyroid and thyroid are important in calcium ion balance. Calcitonin lowers blood calcium. Parathyroid hormone raises blood calcium. PTH increases circulating calcium ion by increasing calcium absorption in the kidneys, increasing calcitriol production of the vitamin D, which is going to increase calcium absorption in the digestive system, and causes the release of calcium from bone. People don't really suffer from elevated calcium levels. And here's the little diagram, which is really quite useful. So here we've got, we're off of homeostasis and blood calcium levels are rising. The thyroid gland will then produce calcitonin, which is going to get rid of the calcium, and it's going to do that by depositing it in the bones or having us excrete it in our urine, and homeostasis is restored. But if the calcium levels fall, PTH is going to be stimulated, and it's going to increase reabsorb. We won't secrete it in our urine. Calcium will be released from the bones, and more calcium will be absorbed from the digestive system because of vitamin D. Homeostasis is restored.